In the year 1247, in the cold silence of a winter morning in northern France, a 7-year-old girl named Aveline stepped through the wooden gates of the Abbey of Saint Croix. The hinges creaked like something ancient waking from sleep, and as the heavy doors shut behind her, the life she once knew disappeared forever. For thousands of children across medieval Europe, this moment was not a choice. It was an obligation, a family strategy, a desperate economic solution, or a religious offering. What awaited them inside those stone walls was far darker than the serene illustrations found in illuminated manuscripts. For many children, medieval convents were not peaceful places of prayer. They were strict, isolating, punishing institutions where childhood vanished on the day a child arrived. To understand why families sent children into convents, one must understand the world outside in the 13th century. Medieval Europe was a landscape ruled by rigid social order and strict expectations. Noble families viewed religious houses as tools of political strategy. A daughter entering a convent meant one fewer dowry to pay. Merchants and peasants saw monastic life as a path to stability in a world where disease, famine, and war constantly threatened survival. And the Church welcomed children eagerly, seeing them as pure vessels who could be shaped early to ensure a lifetime of religious discipline. But for the children themselves, the moment they entered a convent marked the beginning of a life governed by silence, obedience, and harsh discipline. Medieval monastic rules, shaped by orders such as the Benedictines and Cistercians, touched every aspect of daily existence. Children were expected to rise before dawn, pray 8 times a day, eat in silence, sleep in cold stone dormitories, and spend long hours memorizing scripture or performing chores that often exceeded their physical strength. Aveline, like many child oblates, was brought to the convent by her parents and ceremonially placed on the altar as a living offering to God. This symbolic gesture disguised the reality that she was now bound for life. At the age of 7, she was required to renounce earthly pleasures, surrender her possessions, and accept the authority of the abbess, a figure both respected and feared. Medieval writers described the abbess as the spiritual mother of the community, but accounts from the period also show she possessed near absolute power over the children under her care. From her first night, Aveline confronted customs that would horrify the modern world. She slept on a straw mattress shared with multiple girls, the air cold enough that her breath rose in pale clouds. The bells woke the convent before sunrise, and the children had to rise instantly, even in freezing winters. Their morning routine included washing with icy water, reciting prayers by candlelight, and sitting through long, punishing hours of lessons in Latin and Scripture. Education in convents was strict, often brutal. Medieval pedagogy viewed discipline as essential to spiritual and moral formation. Many convent schoolmistresses used rods, switches, or leather straps to enforce memorization. A child stumbling through her Latin declensions or mispronouncing a psalm could be struck across the palms or shoulders. Chroniclers of the time rarely criticized such treatment because physical punishment was considered an unquestioned necessity for building obedience. Silence was another harsh reality. Many convents enforced the rule of silence, allowing children to speak only at restricted times. Breaking silence could result in public penance, such as kneeling on stone floors for hours. For a young child, this created emotional isolation as painful as any physical hardship. The convent was not a warm, tolerant environment. It was an institution obsessed with controlling the body, the tongue, and even the thoughts of its inhabitants. Food in convents was simple, often inadequate. Children ate small portions of vegetables, bread, and occasionally fish. Meat was forbidden. Meals were taken in absolute silence, while a nun read from religious texts warning of the dangers of temptation and indulgence. Hunger was common, especially during long fasts. Children fasted not because their bodies could bear it, but because they were required to follow the same rules as adults. One of the most disturbing aspects of life in medieval convents was the use of child labor. Although religious houses claimed spiritual goals, many relied on the unpaid labor of children to survive. Young girls spun wool, tended gardens, carried water, cleaned the complex, and assisted in the scriptorium. These tasks often lasted from sunrise until dusk. In winter, work was done in near total darkness, illuminated only by weak candles that provided little warmth. Beyond this daily hardship lay something more psychologically damaging, the complete erasure of childhood identity. Once a child became a novice, she was expected to separate herself from her former life. Her clothing was replaced with the convent habit, usually a heavy wool garment that scratched the skin. Her hair was cut short or veiled. She was given a new name to symbolize the death of her old self. This stripping away of identity was not symbolic to the child. It was an emotional shock that many never truly recovered from. Despite these harsh conditions, medieval sources rarely describe the suffering of child oblates directly. Instead, their experiences must be pieced together from monastic rules, administrative records, letters, and the accounts of a few individuals who escaped or later wrote about their childhoods. One such voice was that of the nun Elizabeth of Skonau, who described childhood in a convent as a constant struggle to balance fear, duty, and faith. Another source, the writings of the reforming monk Peter Damian, openly criticized the cruelty in some religious houses, especially those that punished children with extreme harshness or coerced them into vows before they reached maturity. Aveline's life at Saint, while followed patterns documented across Europe. The novice mistress drilled discipline into her from the moment she entered. Every mistake was corrected sharply. Every sign of hesitation was interpreted as disobedience. Even innocent laughter could be considered a spiritual weakness. For a child who once played in the fields with her siblings, the contrast was stark. The convent took away not only physical freedom, but emotional expression. Daily rituals reinforced the idea that the child belonged not to herself, but to the institution. During Mass, she knelt for long periods on cold stone floors. During confession, she was encouraged to confess sins she could barely understand. During processions, she walked silently in line, the sound of her wooden shoes echoing against the cloister walls. Even sleep offered little refuge, as night prayers sometimes woke the children in the middle of the night. The convent's rhythm was relentless, and the body of a child was not made to withstand its demands. Yet within these walls, these hardships were considered normal, even holy. Medieval society viewed suffering as a path to spiritual purity. Enduring pain was believed to strengthen virtue. Obedience was considered the highest moral achievement. For adults who chose monastic life voluntarily, these expectations could be accepted, even embraced. But for children forced into this life, the psychological burden was immense. Aveline's story was the story of thousands. Children who entered medieval convents often disappeared from the historical record, swallowed by a system that believed their suffering was necessary. Their lives illuminate a dark and largely forgotten chapter of medieval history, one that reveals not the sanctity of the convent, but its capacity for silent cruelty. By the middle of the 14th century, the experiences of children in medieval convents across Europe formed a consistent pattern of discipline, silence, and relentless spiritual pressure. While adults who chose monastic life entered with understanding and consent, children, some as young as 5 or 6, were thrust into this world with no preparation and no ability to comprehend the obligations imposed on them. For these young lives, the convent was not a refuge. It was a controlled environment where strict discipline overshadowed any notion of childhood innocence. When a child like Aveline entered the convent, one of the first lessons she learned was that discipline was not only expected, it was considered divine. Medieval religious thought was deeply shaped by the idea that the human will must be broken early so that obedience to God could take root without question. Because of this, physical and psychological punishments were not merely tolerated, they were often encouraged by the strictest abbesses and novice mistresses. Punishment could come in many forms. The most common was corporal discipline. A child who failed to memorize a psalm, who slouched during prayer, who whispered to another novice, or who broke silence during meals, might be struck on the palms or knuckles with a rod. Historically documented accounts from religious houses in Germany, France, and England describe the use of birch rods, leather straps, wooden paddles, and even bundles of nettles. These punishments were seen as corrective, not cruel, reflecting a medieval belief that physical discomfort purified the soul. For young children, however, the true weight of punishment was not always physical. The convent employed psychological methods that were even more devastating. One such practice was the use of public humiliation. A child might be made to kneel at the center of the refectory during meals, while other nuns and novices watched her in silence. She might be required to hold out her arms in a cruciform position for long periods until trembling overcame her. In some convents, children were forced to wear signs around their necks labeled with their faults, such as disobedience or laziness. This public exposure of sin was intended to build humility, but for a child it often fostered shame and emotional distress. The environment itself intensified the psychological burden. Medieval convents were cold, dimly lit, and silent for most of the day. Silence was one of the strictest rules imposed on children. Many convents followed the rule of silence, allowing speech only during designated hours or only with explicit permission. For a child, especially one removed from their family, this silence could feel suffocating. Without the ability to express fear, confusion, or sadness, many children internalized these emotions, resulting in lifelong trauma. The abbess, the high, stranking woman in the convent, played a central role in enforcing these rules. She embodied both spiritual authority and institutional power. While some abbesses were compassionate leaders, many others adhered strictly to monastic tradition, believing that harsh discipline strengthened moral character. Medieval letters and administrative records reveal abbesses who maintained absolute control, monitoring not only the actions of children but their thoughts and emotions. Even a child's private doubts could be interpreted as rebellion. Beyond punishment and silence, children endured the rigid structure of monastic schedule. The bells dictated the rhythm of life. The day began in darkness, usually around 2 or 3 a.m. For matins, the night prayer. Children were shaken awake by older nuns and expected to rise immediately. Sleep deprivation was a normal part of monastic life. After night prayers came periods of study, additional prayers throughout the day, long hours of manual labor, and limited rest. Despite their young age, children were often expected to perform tasks suited to adults. In many convents, this meant spinning wool, weaving, cooking, sweeping, carrying water from distant wells, and tending gardens. During outbreaks of illness, which were common in crowded, poorly heated convents, children were sometimes assigned to care for older nuns, washing their clothing or bringing them food. Historical records also indicate that children participated in the scriptorium, where they copied religious texts under strict supervision. For many, this delicate work caused eye strain and physical exhaustion. Fasting was another hardship imposed on children. The medieval church required fasting on numerous days throughout the year, sometimes amounting to over 100 fasting days annually. Children were not exempt. They were expected to eat smaller portions and sometimes skip meals entirely. While adults might endure fasting as a spiritual challenge, for children with growing bodies, it was physically dangerous. Malnutrition, anemia, and weakness were common, though rarely acknowledged in official documents. One of the most haunting aspects of child life in convents was what historians call the cloistered childhood. Children were raised in an environment completely removed from the natural world and from normal human relationships. They rarely interacted with boys, men, or even women outside their convent. They did not play. They did not run through fields. They did not form typical friendships. Their days were filled with responsibility far beyond their age and shaped by fear of punishment and fear of God. To the adults in charge, this was considered proper religious upbringing. To the children, it was a slow erasure of self. Some children accepted this life quietly, believing it was their destiny. Others resisted, though resistance often resulted in harsher punishment. A few rare accounts describe children attempting to escape their convents. One such case, recorded in a 12th century French chronicle, tells of a young novice who attempted to flee after repeated punishments. She was caught, brought back, and placed under even stricter supervision. Attempts to leave were considered grave offenses, not just against the convent, but against God. But not all resistance was physical. Some children resisted emotionally or spiritually. Letters and confessions from medieval nuns who entered the convent as children reveal lifelong internal conflict. They describe feeling unworthy, sinful, or terrified of punishment. Some believed that their childhood mistakes had condemned them to divine judgment. Others admitted they felt disconnected from God entirely, unable to understand the religious pressures forced on them at an age when they could not comprehend abstract concepts like sin or salvation. For children like Aveline, survival in the convent required constant vigilance. A wrong word could bring punishment. A moment of weakness during prayer could be interpreted as spiritual failure. A pause during work could be labeled laziness. Even crying, one of the natural responses of a frightened child, was discouraged because it signaled lack of spiritual strength. Many children learned quickly to suppress their emotions, to hide their fears, and to obey without question. As Aveline approached adolescence, her responsibilities increased. Older novices were expected to assist the abbess, instruct younger children, and take on more demanding chores. Punishments for mistakes became more severe. The pressure to prove religious devotion intensified. Adolescence, which in the outside world might bring exploration and learning, was in the convent a time of deeper submission. Yet it is important to understand that in medieval Europe, these practices were not seen as abuse. They were viewed as essential spiritual training. The harshness of convent life reflected broader medieval beliefs about suffering and salvation. To the church, discipline purified the soul. To the families who sent their daughters away, the convent offered stability and respectability. To the children inside, however, it often felt like a place where joy, identity, and childhood were stripped away in the name of faith. The suffering of these children remained hidden for centuries. Few spoke of it. Most adapted or resigned themselves to their fate. But the echoes of their silent childhoods shaped generations of women who lived out their lives inside stone walls, never fully understanding the world beyond them. By the dawn of the 15th century, medieval Europe had fully normalized the presence of children in convents. Thousands of young girls across England, France, Italy, Germany, and the Iberian Peninsula lived behind stone walls, shaped not by the rhythms of ordinary childhood, but by the unyielding discipline of religious life. Their suffering was rarely recorded, for medieval society did not understand childhood as we do today. Instead of being viewed as vulnerable, developing individuals, children were often seen as small adults, capable of participating in labor, responsible for spiritual obligations, and subject to the same moral expectations as fully grown women. This misunderstanding of childhood had devastating consequences inside convents. The emotional, spiritual, and physical toll on children was immense, though the Church of the time interpreted these hardships as necessary steps in cultivating piety and obedience. But beneath the surface of silence, obedience, and ritual, these children lived complex emotional lives that were invisible to the adults who controlled them. Aveline, now in her mid-teens, had grown accustomed to the unchanging rhythm of monastic life. But familiarity did not mean acceptance. Like many children raised in convents, she lived in an emotional landscape marked by doubt, fear, confusion, and longing. The structured silence prevented her from forming deep friendships, though bonds did develop quietly among some novices who shared whispered conversations when no one was listening. These moments of connection were precious but dangerous. Emotional repression was one of the deepest wounds inflicted upon convent children. Medieval convents encouraged self-denial to such an extent that many girls learned to view their natural emotions as sins. Anger was disobedience, sadness was a sign of weak faith, joy was suspicious, fear indicated spiritual immaturity, affection was discouraged, even curiosity was seen as a temptation that would lead the mind astray. One of the most psychologically damaging practices in many convents was enforced guilt. Children were taught that every mistake, no matter how small, offended God. If Aveline forgot a line of scripture, she was told she had failed spiritually. If she struggled to stay awake during long night prayers, the novice mistress accused her of lacking devotion. These constant reminders of spiritual inadequacy shaped how children saw themselves. Many grew up believing they were perpetually unworthy, perpetually flawed, and perpetually guilty. The confessional intensified this emotional burden. Medieval confession was not the gentle counseling it later became. Children were expected to confess weekly or even daily, detailing every thought, every moment of distraction, every flash of emotion. A child who had no sins to confess was accused of dishonesty. The process forced children to examine every part of their inner life through a lens of fear. Instead of learning emotional self-regulation, they learned emotional self-condemnation. Spiritual pressure was equally overwhelming. The Church believed that suffering brought one closer to God. Pain, hunger, exhaustion, and humiliation were reframed as holy trials. But children like Aveline lacked the emotional maturity to understand or cope with these expectations. Their spiritual education was centered not on love or compassion, but on duty, fear, and submission. The physical environment of a medieval convent also contributed to the toll on children. Many convents were cold, damp, and poorly ventilated. Winters were especially harsh. Children slept on straw pallets or thin mattresses, often sharing blankets that provided little warmth. Illness was frequent. Respiratory infections, joint pain, malnutrition, and chronic fatigue were common. Yet children were rarely excused from their duties unless they were on the brink of collapse. Medical care within convents was limited. While some convents had infirmaries, they relied on herbal remedies and basic treatments. Chronic conditions went untreated. Pain was often dismissed as a spiritual trial. A child with aching legs from long hours of kneeling was told to endure in honor of Christ. A girl with persistent cough was believed to be purified through suffering. Another physical burden came from manual labor. Although modern readers might imagine convent life as quiet contemplation, medieval convents functioned like self-sustaining communities. They baked their own bread, grew their own food, wove their own clothes, and copied their own books. Children participated in all of these tasks. Spinning and weaving required long hours of repetitive movement. Carrying water demanded strength that many children did not yet have. Some convents assigned children to grind grain, an exhausting job involving heavy millstones. While these tasks were framed as service to God, they were physically draining. Over time, the lack of rest, inadequate nutrition, and constant labor left many children weakened. Their growth was stunted. Their bones grew brittle. Their muscles remained underdeveloped. Historical medical examinations of skeletal remains from monastic sites show signs of physical stress consistent with long-term malnutrition and heavy labor performed during childhood. But the toll was not only physical or emotional, it was also intellectual. Convent education was narrow and rigid. Children were taught scripture, psalms, and ecclesiastical Latin. They were trained to copy texts precisely. But their intellectual world was confined. They were discouraged from asking questions outside religious instruction. Critical thinking, creativity, and exploration, the kinds of activities essential to healthy cognitive development, were absent. For a child whose mind craved stimulation and discovery, this limited education could feel suffocating. Yet not all convents enforced discipline with equal severity. Some were relatively gentle, especially in regions influenced by more compassionate interpretations of monastic rule. Some abbesses believed that kindness could also cultivate devotion. In these rare environments, children might receive nurturing guidance, access to gardens, moderate workloads, or opportunities for artistic expression. But such places were exceptions, and they have often been romanticized in later writings. The majority of convents adhered strictly to monastic discipline, leaving little space for warmth or leniency. Despite these harsh realities, some girls developed genuine attachment to convent life. Over time, the convent became the only world they knew. The rituals became familiar. The predictability of routine offered a sense of stability in a turbulent medieval world. For Aveline, the outside world had become a distant memory, blurred by years of isolation. The convent defined her identity. It shaped her beliefs, her fears, her understanding of the world, and her sense of self-worth. Yet even in such acceptance, there remained an undercurrent of loss, the loss of family, the loss of freedom, the loss of childhood itself. One of the most painful elements for many convent children was the severed connection to their families. Although some families visited, many did not. Travel was difficult, dangerous, and expensive. The Church also discouraged emotional attachment to family, viewing it as a distraction from religious duty. As a result, many children grew up without ever again seeing the parents who left them at the convent gates. Their only memories of home faded over the years, replaced by the cold stone corridors of monastic life. Some historical records show that children sometimes wept silently at night, missing the warmth of family. Others wrote years later of a profound sense of abandonment. For some, this emotional wound never healed. The spiritual toll was equally long, lasting. Many girls spent their adolescence wrestling with guilt, fear, and a sense of inadequacy instilled by years of rigid religious instruction. They internalized the belief that obedience was the highest virtue and that questioning authority was sinful. Even as adults, these women struggled to separate genuine faith from the fear-based spirituality imposed upon them as children. By the time Aveline reached adulthood, the convent had molded her completely. Her identity was a product of discipline, silence, and duty. She had learned to suppress her desires, hide her emotions, and accept suffering as part of her spiritual journey. She, like many others raised from childhood in the convent, had been shaped not by choice but by force. The true tragedy of medieval convent children was not simply the harsh conditions they endured. It was the loss of who they might have become. Their potential was shaped by walls meant not only to keep the world out, but to confine the child within. By the early 16th century, centuries of strict discipline, spiritual control, and emotional isolation had shaped generations of women raised from childhood in convents. Their stories, although rarely preserved in their own words, formed an invisible thread woven through the history of medieval Europe. These women lived their entire lives behind cloister walls, carrying with them the emotional scars of a childhood that the world outside regarded as holy but which, in truth, had been marked by deprivation and loss. The long-term consequences of such an upbringing were profound. Many of these women matured into nuns who resembled their novice mistresses, strict, obedient, and committed to preserving the discipline that had been forced upon them. Aveline, now in her late 20s, was a product of the same system. She had become a teacher of younger novices, repeating lessons she once feared. Her voice, calm but rigid, corrected children the way she had been corrected. Her movements followed the rhythm of rituals that had dictated her entire life. This cycle was not accidental. Medieval monasticism depended on shaping children early so that they could one day perpetuate the system. A woman who entered a convent at 18 or 20 had memories of a world outside, personal opinions, emotional autonomy, and perhaps desires incompatible with strict monastic discipline. But a child raised from infancy or early childhood had no such resistance. Her identity was formed entirely by the convent. She was the perfect vessel, obedient, unquestioning, and spiritually molded to fit a life of service. Yet beneath this outward conformity, many women carried inward struggles, ones that shaped the emotional atmosphere of entire convent communities. Medieval records reveal hints of these struggles in confessions, letters, and the rebukes issued by church authorities. Some nuns wrestled with lifelong guilt, believing they could never be holy enough. Others suffered from chronic anxiety, shaped by a childhood of constant spiritual pressure. Some battled episodes of depression, which the medieval church understood poorly and often treated as a sign of spiritual weakness. In a few heartbreaking cases, women left writings that described lifelong feelings of abandonment or grief, traces of trauma stemming from being separated from their families as children. These writings rarely survived in full, but the fragments show a consistent emotional thread. They longed for the human connections they never had, they feared intimacy, they felt disconnected from their own emotions. Their entire understanding of themselves had been shaped by rigid instruction, discipline, and silence. But these human costs were largely invisible in the grand narrative of medieval history. Instead, society viewed convent-raised girls through a lens of admiration. They were seen as paragons of purity, discipline, and spiritual devotion. Kings, nobles, and bishops donated wealth to convents. Families boasted about daughters who became nuns. Religious chroniclers celebrated the strict discipline of monastic schools as evidence of holiness, not harm. Yet the system was not without critics. Even in medieval times, some religious reformers recognized the dangers of placing children in monastic life too young. The Benedictine reformer Peter Damian spoke out strongly against forcing children into vows before they were mature enough to understand their meaning. He argued that coercion corrupted true devotion and led to broken spirits rather than holy ones. A few councils of the Church issued decrees attempting to limit the age at which children could take final vows, but these reforms were inconsistently enforced and often ignored by communities that relied on child labor and early indoctrination. Despite criticism, the practice continued for centuries. Families, driven by economic or political motives, still sent their young daughters to convents. The Church, viewing children as spiritually malleable, still encouraged early dedication. And convents, needing labor and committed novices, still accepted children eagerly. But the system began to crack during the Renaissance and the early Reformation. These intellectual shifts introduced ideas about individual agency, human emotion, and educational reform. Humanist thinkers like Erasmus argued that education should nurture the mind rather than crush the spirit. Protestant reformers condemned forced vows entirely, insisting that a true relationship with God required free will. Even within Catholic Europe, voices emerged calling for gentler instruction in monastic schools. As the world changed, the role of convents also changed. The Council of Trent 1545-1563 imposed stricter rules on monastic communities, emphasizing adult consent and attempting to prevent children from being forced into vows too young. These reforms marked a significant turning point. While convents remained strict institutions, the practice of raising very young children inside them began to decline across Europe. Yet for those who had already lived through the hardships of medieval convent childhood, the change came too late. Avelaine's life, like countless others, unfolded within walls built not only from stone but from centuries of religious tradition. Through the years, she watched children come and go, some frightened, some obedient, some resistant, all shaped by the same unyielding system. She saw the hopes and identities of young girls molded into conformity. She witnessed illnesses that could not be healed. She enforced rules she had once endured. But she also saw something more subtle, the quiet strength of girls who found ways to create small pockets of humanity within an institution built to suppress it. Whispered encouragement during long prayers. Smiles exchanged during moments when no one was watching. Hidden acts of kindness that broke the rigid silence. Slipping extra bread to a hungry child. Tending to a sick novice with gentle hands. Sharing memories of family in hushed tones. These small rebellions were the flickers of humanity that survived despite the system. As Aveline grew older, she began to understand a truth that many convent-raised women eventually recognized. Devotion built on fear was not the same as faith. Her understanding of God, shaped by years of punishment and discipline, shifted slowly toward compassion. She began to treat younger novices with more patience, offering explanations instead of punishments, comfort instead of guilt. This subtle transformation, repeated quietly in convents across Europe, contributed to the gradual softening of monastic upbringing in the centuries that followed. But even as some convents reformed, the legacy of the medieval system endured. The emotional scars carried by generations of women remained unseen and unrecorded. The world celebrated their piety, but never heard their suppressed voices. Their suffering was sanctified, buried beneath the weight of religious tradition. Historically, the greatest tragedy of childhood in medieval convents was not simply the harsh discipline or physical deprivation. Though these were severe, it was the denial of childhood itself. A child forced into monastic life lost the freedom to explore, to make mistakes safely, to play, to imagine, to ask questions, to form identity outside the constraints of religious duty. Childhood was replaced with obedience. Emotion was replaced with guilt. Natural curiosity was replaced with memorized scripture and fear of sin. These consequences rippled outward through generations. The women formed by this system became teachers, abbesses, and spiritual authorities who shaped the next generation of convent children. The cycle continued, century after century, until broader societal change forced it to evolve.